All right, there we go. Hey, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in this fine world. My name is George Neese. I'm going to be your facilitator, coach, mentor, or trainer, depending on where you are in the journey in Agile and DevOps. Welcome to the WebAge Solutions Digital Transformation webinar series. And I hope everyone, this finds everyone well today. If you have any issues with sound, with anything else, feel free to throw that into the chat. If you cannot hear me, then that would be a problem. So at this point, you should be able to hear me. And if anybody would like to raise their hand or flip a chat to say that you can, that would be wonderful. I'm assuming since the little thing is telling me it can hear me and see me, that everyone on the call should be able to. Good, thank you. I see hands and I appreciate that. Sweet, sweet, sweet. Thank you, Vitaly. All right, so now we're going to jump in and talk through a number of different areas. Really the whole point, provided that this actually, why is this not moving? There we go. It helps if I know how to operate my own deck. So I'm doing a little Agile deck handling at the moment. So what we're going to be talking about is Agile and DevOps, essentially best practices and pitfalls across the two of them. And the notion here is that we've got velocity, quality and reliability driving time to value. So Agile and DevOps being a part of a larger transformation or digital transformation effort for many organizations. And so we'll actually tie some of that back in as well. I've never actually delivered this deck before, so I expect we'll, get out in time for some questions. And if we start to run towards completion, I'll probably accelerate. Now, for anybody who's ever heard me speaking, you realize that I probably can talk just about as fast as JFK or Martin Luther King or somebody like that. So I can actually crank out a deck in a very short period of time. My background prior to being in WebAge's cloud, DevOps, and digital transformation stream lead was to work for Accenture as a consultant for years, spin up a digital commerce and marketing company and sell that off to Publicis. And before that, I worked for IBM. Before that, I was a chef, and before that, I was a farm kid. So plenty of experience. I may be the only person that you're probably ever going to meet from the great state of North Dakota in the United States. Just 1 second. There we go. Small power issue. Turned out I was on a phone with no power, so I thought I better quit or switch before it turns out I shut myself down. So history of Agile, lean, and quality on one side, Agile in a nutshell, DevOps really demystified, some digital transformation to tie that all together. Snares, traps, and tales of woe around opportunities that I've seen over the last, really, with Agile, I mean, technically you could have been doing Agile 20 years ago, although it would have changed quite a bit over time. And no surprise in DevOps, at least from the time of the hashtag, you'd be about 10 years out, but you could have been doing DevOps quite a long time ago, or some DevOps practices. And then, of course, success stories and best practices, really speaking again to the other side of the coin, hopefully the good news that has happened over that same period of time, rather than some of the more troubling things that we've seen in that snares, traps, and tales of woe. And then we'll leave some time for questions. So when we think about this, I mean, Agile itself goes back 400 years or more to the beginning of the whole notion of scientific method. And so we have, Francis Bacon is a guy who was a favorite of the king, got himself kicked out from King James, found himself with very little money and very little to do, and decided to promote scientific method. So he didn't create scientific method, but just the idea of plan, do, study, and act that we see quite a bit farther on in the history with Walter Shewart and Bell Labs, arguably some of the folks who invented much of what we see in technology. So, if you go back 400 years south of London, we've got one village where people are dying regularly. We've got another one where people are dying less regularly and more on a normal basis. You look down the well in the one village, you see a dead sheep. You look on the other side, nothing. You pull the sheep out, and 2 weeks later, folks start to die at a much less frequent basis. And so, true story, at least if you can believe, things from 400 years ago when essentially the victors wrote the history, some of the same thing that we see today. So fast forward there, and we see Shewart, who arguably as a mentor to Deming, helped to rebuild much of the world after World War II and initially, helped to, with quite a number of other folks, to really crank up the Toyota Production System, or TPS, which blends itself all into the birth of Lean. So Lean itself spawning many things, including Agile, DevOps, Six Sigma, and many other types of essentially quality initiatives, total quality management, TQM, continuous quality, all of the things we see today around testing, automation, Agile testing. And so those different angles of Lean applied to software engineering became the foundations for things like Scrum and extreme programming, feature-driven development, test-driven development, much of what we see in terms of automation, and of course into DevOps. So from a strictly Agile speaking, if we think about it, get a whole bunch of geeks or nerds together at a ski resort, and either there's no snow or they don't ski or snowboard, and they create the Agile Manifesto. Many of the folks who created the Agile Manifesto have since gone on to do all sorts of other things, because if you go back, I mean, we're talking almost 2 decades ago, DevOps, spawning off to some extent, and there is, of course, the notion that, DevOps is just Agile 2.0, which I would argue is mostly fiction, but, something to consider in terms of the use of agility. And Agile itself, is a word like love. Agile is an idea of doing iterative development, taking ownership, customer centricity, lots of things that it's actually been taken for and then turned, on its head. Many of the people who were part of the Agile Manifesto, from the Martin Fowlers, the, Jeff, the Sutherland gentleman, the Schwaber gentleman, lots of other folks along that path, Beatty, all of them now are largely either in some kind of thought leadership role or have completely gone under the radar, 3 or 4 of them. But everyone else is working in enterprise Scrum, Agile, DevOps, software engineering as a leader for the most part. So from the Agile Manifesto itself, I mean, the whole idea is that, there's this individuals and interactions, working software, customer collaboration, responding to change, and individual principles. Of course, much of that has actually been turned over to ways that the original founders have had to fight regularly. I mean, working software over the documentation piece, people have taken that to mean we don't need documentation. And of course, that's mostly a fiction. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools does not mean that we don't have any tools, does not mean that we don't have any process. All of that means is that we're trying to iterate through this. Collaboration over negotiation doesn't mean that there isn't negotiations that are part of almost everything in our lives, of course. And response to change, many times, especially when we start thinking about from change management, organizational change management, the things that are really required to bring Agile and DevOps at scale to a large enterprise do require planning, but then as important, they require execution. And back to our, Deming-esque, Shewart scientific method, plan, do, check, act, plan, do, study, act, essentially iterate. Create these feedback loops that are also a core, flow and feedback being 2 of the 3 core elements in the DevOps handbook, a recommended reading for almost everyone. If you're not reading the DevOps handbook or have not read the Phoenix Project and a number of other texts that we'll talk about, both from Agile and DevOps, it's very likely that your senior leadership have. So always nice to know what they're thinking, or at least where they're getting their information. So from a principles of Agile, I mean, essentially, these folks created 12 principles to drive this, and they've been drawn out and set up, and all sorts of pictures, and probably there's even an Agile manifesto with Dilbert, although I didn't think about looking for it until just now. I would guess it would be pretty funny, considering Scott Adams' view of both technology and business within the Dilbert realm. So prioritizing, customers in terms of this through early delivery. Well, it's the idea of prioritizing the customer is not necessarily just through the early delivery. What this does is it allows us to, identify gaps in intent, because continuous integration and delivery with DevOps and the whole notion of agility is not just to drive things fast. It's really to identify where we may not have fully understood what somebody was meaning when they said, "Can I have this software?" Now, on the flip side of that, welcoming requirements, as they mentioned here, are good, because the idea is that people are not only going to want to add things, they're also going to want to remove things. However, when we talk later in terms of tales of woe, this notion of welcoming changing requirements, also invites the notion of welcoming a changing timeline and a changing budget. Some things that we have to consider, because many people do Agile development within a very waterfall funding and requirements world. So we'll actually talk through some of that as well. And again, feel free at any point, if you'd like to raise your hand, you have a question. As a person who worked as an executive for Accenture, I could basically talk your face off probably for about 2 days straight, just taking time to breathe and take a drink of water. So, this deliver frequently, this, no surprise when we see it, this blends into the Agile Manifesto into our notion of continuous integration and continuous delivery. Not necessarily into continuous deployment, but we'll touch on that a bit later. So people working together, well, aha moment. People working together means that then when we do start to ideate a system, ideate a software, ideate a process, I mean, you can use Agile to do contract negotiation in terms of creating a template, in terms of setting up, a smaller scale iteration, not necessarily into our 1, 2, 3 week sprints that we would expect in software engineering, but for doing a contract negotiation, you could easily use Agile and start breaking it down into 1, 2, 3 days for a sprint, seeing some kind of outcome from that. And in this case, making sure that we're getting towards the deadline that we're expecting, or towards the time box that we're expecting, and for sure, getting to the deliverables and those kinds of key output, the product increment, essentially. What is it tangibly that we're producing in Agile, regardless of whether it's from a business process, in terms of value stream mapping, it's a software engineering, it's an infrastructure as code, it's data architecture, almost anything can have some Agile flavor. Now, I would hesitate to suggest that you should try to get your family to do Agile, but you never know. I've had a number of people over a lifetime who have, and surprisingly enough, were able to stay married, which I think was pretty impressive, but also have been able to make some interesting observations, as well as teaching their children Agile. Because imagine, you're a technology person now and you're 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years old, or maybe younger, 20 years old, and all of a sudden you're teaching your children how Agile and Scrum and DevOps and some of these things evolve. They go very well prepared into their upper level education and then out into the market. So building projects around motivated individuals. Well, all of this is not necessarily about, we just have one lone ranger. The whole idea is motivating the entire team. And how do we do that? By giving them some ownership, some shared responsibility. So efficient and effective are key, because not only are we trying to get things to be consistent within most organizations, it's not a matter of one size fits all, but it's one size fits many, and then we have a rigorous yet accelerated exception process, allowing us to have these conversations, this face-to-face, this communication. And it doesn't necessarily mean we have to be in the same geography, the same country. even the same company for that matter, because folks who work in government regularly, especially when you start thinking about some of the complex structures they have, I mean, somebody who is working in one of the military branches ultimately has to work with all of the other agencies that are involved there, reports up to Department of Defense, and then ultimately has, Congress, or in some cases the president as their top level leader. So a mixture of civilians and military personnel, of contractors, vendors, partners, all of these things, this complexity, all involving communications to understand what the long pole in the tent is. So what is it that we have to get done? What are the things we've never done before? All of these things blend into, our notion of Agile. So working software, but Agile itself is not just a software methodology. Agile is a notion of doing iterative development of anything. So that could be farming, agriculture, construction. The thing is we have to always consider, what do we have to know up front to be able to be successful when we're done, or to be able to be called successful. Somebody who just walks up and starts building a house without having an architecture, a plan, all of the notions of what we need in terms of inspections is going to very rapidly fail. Almost nothing that we do in this world does not have at least some kind of a charter, some kind of a business process, something that allows us to identify what is the business value we're creating. Very few software teams, very few, finance teams, anyone else in an organization just has an open checkbook to let's go just do some stuff. So the processes of this are then promoting sustainable development. So if you think about it, sustainable and a pace and all the rest of it involves, back to the Toyota production system, not overworking people, not creating so much stress that we start to break the process, not having large amounts of unplanned work, things that are regularly interrupting our team, the so-called, not committed or involved, in some cases involved people can actually drag our team away, but also the notion of people that are neither committed or involved, who regularly, for good reasons, walk into our team's world. Almost every organization has some charitable component, United Way, JDRF, cancer research, the Susan Komen Walk, any number of things that are very well-intentioned, community support, all of those things tying into it as well, but we have to understand what is the impact in terms of that flow. So attention to excellence and design and the rest of it means we still do have design. We do have architecture and standards and these things, because if I was just developing something on my own or with 4 or 5 of my friends or coworkers, I can create all of those things on the fly because we are a tight bunch. We've worked together many times. Some of the common sense things that are there as our standards and our design. But for almost anything else, there has to be this notion of having enough to know what direction we have to vector. And in some cases, we have to have more information rather than none. But none is almost never, even in a maintenance project, something that you can get away with. So simplicity, and all of this comes back to just, why would we over-engineer something? We talked through that a bunch of times through this deck. So best means gold master, and we'll talk through some of that too. And then at intervals, team reflecting. So in Agile and many of the Agile methodologies, we replace the word meeting with some ceremony, some event, a sprint, a review, a retrospect, a huddle, all these kinds of words that in reality just mean let's have a meeting. So how are we going to get that cadence of meetings correct? So in a nutshell, and for those of us who remember all the nutshell books, just like some of the books that had the little creatures on them, we had lots of things there that were part of this. The whole idea of working through all of our little, for that matter, nutshells. So we're going to drill into that, and you'll excuse me for that. Sorry, I didn't have the harp music on intentionally, but somehow I had muted my other phone. Anyway, so we took care of that. So Agile, Scrum in a nutshell. So this is, there's lots of Agile methodologies. The one that seems to be the most popular for the majority of people that I've worked with in enterprise, Fortune 500, Global 500 over the last, 10 years has really been Scrum. There's still plenty of people doing XP. People blend Kanban in a number of ways, and Kanban and XP having some similarities in terms of the continuous flow. But really, the time boxing in Scrum makes a lot of people in leadership very happy because it time boxes things, and it actually requires you to show progress on a regular basis, which means I can start scheduling recurring meetings, and all of that makes a lot of people a lot more comfortable. Once we get to that comfort level, then maybe we switch in some cases to things that are a bit more continuous. But we start with a vision, a product charter, vision. All of that converts, of course, for us into, or can be driving into requirements. So most of the time we have to know roughly what is the business value we're creating. So business value is typically articulated as BRFR, business requirements and functional requirements. In an agile world, you can still have requirements. In an agile world that's blended into, you know, a notion of a, well, I thought I totally turned that off at some point. It's not to. Try that again. Oh no, I did. Interesting. All right, so we'll just bring it up. There we go. So story maps and product owners. So here we go. Here we have the intersection, and this is where things get much more complicated, because if you think about it, most people's pictures, and even when you start diving into most CSM workshops, so certified Scrum Master, you know, you think of a Scrum Master or a product owner as a singular, one person. And so when we start thinking about creating story maps and just the notion of these roles, it's very common that I can have, in some organizations, multiple Scrum Masters. I can have people who are multiple product owners. And how does that work? Well, if my Scrum Master in my organization is not technical, then there's going to be some kind of pairing in terms of them and their Scrum team to actually get some of that technical detail. In a product owner relationship, in many organizations, you have different people filling that chair. Some places it can be business analysts, other places it can be actually business people. In other cases, it can be project managers. So all of this means that I have to have somebody who's going to be able to articulate priorities across the tasks that we're doing, understand what the business value and the business requirement and what the business is actually trying to get to are within this. And also, you know, how can we kind of have these, not so much notion of SOX separation, but this ability to have more of these people in the conversation. So many organizations have much more complicated pictures of the roles and responsibilities across these things that we have to drive into as well. So things to always consider in this case. So the Scrum Master, of course, and the product owner to some extent help us to drive that process to make sure that we get into that cadence, that rhythm, setting up in terms of length. And here we start to get into some of the consistency issues that we see in many organizations. People think that the way that people operate Scrum should be one of these notions of creativity. So you see many organizations where different sprint lengths, different quantities of story points per hour, other things in terms of human factor, all being up to the team and creating inconsistency and in many cases fragmentation. So the team develops, operates, engineers. So if you think about this, of course we've got developers, we've got operations, we could have quality, architecture, info security, data management. What are the roles and competencies and responsibilities within the organization? How do we bring people together? Do we have release management, release engineers? Do we have deployment engineers? Do we have other roles in terms of security that we have to blend in? Always considering how we're going to achieve velocity, but with the right number of people to allow us to have the correct amount of handoffs. Because a lot of this in terms of flow and velocity is about how you maximize the throughput, and the way that you do that in many cases is to understand your value streams. Understanding how an orchestrated process of software engineering is done for your SDLC, and then where mirroring are the areas where the handoffs are not solid, or are there things that we can start to automate some of the assessment? Can we automate some of the risk assessment to make it easier to flow things? All of these things being part of it. So each sprint, of course, giving us some tangible result, People regularly hide the notion of design in not only Scrum, but in other Agile methodologies by calling them flash builds and spikes and prototypes and all sorts of things that are basically us doing an iterative design. So for one organization that I've been working with over the last year, the notion of the developers create prototypes and those act to inform the design. So not actually taking the time to work with the business to do some more traditional elicitation of requirements, and in this case finding out that because they move in a process that has the developers really encapsulating a lot of the BA work that normally would happen in terms of understanding before being understood with software, we find 3 patterns. If your organization has a 3rd pattern, then maybe that's a good fit. But the first pattern is finish the prototype, business says that's not even close. Second is finish the prototype, business says, well, there's some things right and there's some things wrong. That's closer. And then the third is you are absolutely right, this is perfect, well, let's just add some more stuff to it. So if you're in the number 3 camp, then prototyping with developers to get to your understanding of the business value and the requirements the business has for this software might make sense. But the majority of organizations really fall into, if they do an operation that way, the number 1, number 2, which turns out to have your developers doing a ton of business requirements essentially in software and wasting an awful lot of their bandwidth. So we have to consider, what is our balance? Because literally DevOps and Agile look different in every organization I've been part of. If somebody can walk in and say, Scrum should look just like this in your organization, I would say that sounds very unlikely. Now, I would not argue that point. I would not say that you can't do pure this, pure that, but consider the fact that if you know anybody in any other organization, spend 5 minutes talking to them about the way they do Agile, the way they do DevOps, the way they do cloud adoption, the way they do application modernization, and you will rapidly realize that your world and theirs is quite different. And of course, the other part of that is that nobody's fence on the other side of their fence is really green. There could be some green, there's probably some brown, there's probably some dead patches, because that's the way things really are in the real world for all of us. So artifacts. So what is an artifact? Well, an artifact is actually something I can create that gives me, in this case, a snapshot in time. So a product increment is the tangible results of some time box work stream. So in Scrum, that would be, I did a sprint, this is what came out of it, this is what I'm going to show you in my review. If it went well, then that's good, that could feed later on into our retrospect. If it went poorly, that should feed into our retrospect. So then from a product backlog, everything that we think we have to do. Now, I regularly have people who have interesting notions of all of these things. I worked with another very large company where they create, in one team, create a backlog, and then they try to figure out what the functional requirements are for the business from this backlog of user stories. Well, I find that to be interesting. I find that to be overly complicated. I find that to be very likely to be frustrating. But I am interested to learn, so I'm still watching to see how that's really working for them. Thus far, I'm finding it to be an interesting and challenging way to work, but that doesn't mean that they can't get that working in the way they expect, because people work in a non-traditional way all the time. So burn down charts, but that's not consistent necessarily across the organization or in terms of the incoming, workforce when you need to bring people in. So burn down charts, just giving us this notion of visualization again. So all of these, burn down charts, dashboards, anything that lets us visualize where we are, the point of that is really so that we can have decision support. So quite a number of companies that I've been working with lately are either working on dashboards, or they have dashboards from CI/CD, from some Agile tool set, a Rally, a Jira, something else, a Trello, a Rike, whatever you're using. TFS Release Services or VSTS. So all of these are just ways that we can visualize what's going on. A burn down chart or a dashboard is for allowing us to understand, is this going well? Great. Is this going off track in terms of yellow? So green, yellow, and then finally, is it already off track and we need to take some corrective action? The idea is if I can start to dashboard that, then I can put that on TVs all over the corporate or office or development location or engineering location, similar to what you see with customer service people, right? Walk into any customer service, telecom, customer center, and find TVs that say, here's the volume of calls we have, here's the wait time, here's who's answering these questions the fastest, here's the top 3 questions we have. Lots of ways to actually, put that kind of information up on a big TV screen and keep people informed of what's happening. It lets you pulse what's going on. And the same thing happens here. Burn down charts, and some of these are just quick, easy ways to look and say, those folks need some help. Or, wow, it's going really good for them. And it seems like that's been happening repeatedly. What are they doing right, and how can we leverage that across all of our teams? So where is the things that are opportunities? Where can we help? The opportunities then, of course, could create patterns or learning. Regularly, when we have automations that do things like static code analysis, do security analysis, do just standards checking in terms of some of these, or code coverage, all of these are giving us a way to know that people understand what we're doing, or maybe there's some gaps in understanding, and those we turn into trainable or teachable moments. And so lastly, we get, sprint backlogs. So, and there are other bits and pieces here. Obviously we'll talk through some of those as we go in here, because we don't put the project charter in here, because the charter itself or the product vision are things that are not typically changing regularly over a period of time. And everything else that we mention in here is something that regularly is changing and needs to be monitored in terms of output, currency, what are we doing in terms of prioritization. And so we get to sprint backlogs. So all the user stories, what are we doing right now? What are we doing in this time box? And if you think about it, regularly, again, I have teams who say to me, especially if they don't know me very well, George, we're working on the next sprint, or we're working on the next 2 sprints. We have no idea how long this is going to take. When we get close, we'll know. And I basically have to walk into my special room and think for a minute, and then we come back and we have a conversation. Usually for those conversations, I bring donuts. If you ever are in a conversation with the human resources team and they bring you lunch or breakfast, you can pretty much be sure that it's not going to be a conversation you really wanted to walk into. Similar sense here, a conversation with George when I bring the donuts is usually not something you really wanted to attend per se. So here, this idea that you don't really know when you're going to get done, well, you cannot know everything that's going to get done. You cannot know the entire timeline you have. You don't have to know every single task, but you should be able to take your product backlog, run it through planning poker estimation, and be able to tell me, based on the size of the team and the current velocity estimates you have, how many more sprints is this going to take? And so if you tell me 13 2-week sprints, and that means basically 6 months out, fine, that's okay, as long as I've got that much time. If it's not, then I want to know up front, and that allows me to do better in terms of being able to react, to be able to be proactive. All of this requires proactive understanding. It does still require management, project management. A Scrum Master, a product owner, and even the Scrum team all become engaged in that. This is about having an all brains in the game, and that also means that if you have an architecture group, they're going to get to participate, InfoSec and the security, all the leadership people who are involved, and in many cases, complex mixes of external channel partners, vendors, and others in terms of consultants and work teams. So who is using what we have? So user personas are regularly part of the journey mapping, design, all of that, what are we doing type discussion. But that's literally into everything. So if you're going to be part of the DevOps group in your organization, what are the roles in DevOps? What is it people are doing? Hopefully If you're in software engineering, they're creating software based on targeted business value and understanding of what the business needs. They're packaging it, testing it, delivering it, turning it into production code, and then hopefully having very few incidents, very few issues. But of course, we always have to plan for failure. In Agile, in DevOps, in cloud, all things require us to plan for failure. Everybody has to have some kind of backup plan, a succession plan for people, a succession plan for our applications. What do we do if this doesn't go well? And of course, assuming that if we plan about these kinds of things, then we'll never have to use those plans, which is optimally the goal, but very seldom does that actually work out that way. So here, one of the things that we see in our training and part of our organization is doing this thing called Lego for Scrum. So Lego for Scrum involves us basically using Scrum to build a city for a set of personas, and that, you know, putting the buildings together is an interesting exercise. I find that it really cements the understanding of Scrum. And you can do this with any Agile methodology, but again, since the majority of companies that we work with at WebAge are doing Scrum, you know, we usually lead into any Agile, in this case, gamification, and just in general understanding Scrum. So we've got inventors, those people who live in this city and create cool stuff. Investors who fly in with big bags of money to buy inventions from our inventors. And then we have engineers and managers and people who work in the city to keep things running, to keep the lights on, to make sure we've got water and food and all those things that people need to actually stay alive in most places. And this is a Lake Tahoe or a resort, small resort style city, not some big New York, Chicago, Beijing, you know, London metropolitan area. We're not building the city of Mexico City, at least not in a small workshop. So when we think about this from a team, we've got our product owner, and that could be a complex role, so that could be more than one person. We've got a Scrum Master. Again, in some organizations, I've got Scrum Masters who are composite. They're actually more than one person playing a Scrum Master role for a team or set of teams. And then, of course, we have the Scrum team, which is the people doing the work. So I can do that with anything. So my product owner could be someone who needs to develop from an organization a contract. My Scrum Master could be my contract lead, who's actually understands the business side of the contract as well as the financial side, so that they can drive to the best result for the business with that, you know, customer acquisition. And then the Scrum teamer is normally the group who are going to do the reviews, going to write the contract language, are going to actually be the people who generate my contract deck, for that matter. I could do the same thing with a presentation. So as an Accenture person, you probably know this, there's lots of, you know, PowerPoint decks we create. I could be the person who is delivering from a business value a deck for a customer. I may be acting as a product owner and a Scrum Master in this case, but I don't necessarily have to, because I could be the executive who's the product owner with the client relationship, taking an existing person who knows the offering that I need as my Scrum Master, and then using other people to actually fashion a client-specific PowerPoint deck. And so rather than having weeks of sprints, I'm talking about hours or a day, or maybe a couple of days for each sprint that let me iterate through that deck. Pretty standard, pretty easy. So Scrum Master is a person who's going to actually, you know, have to know both sides of it. So in this case, they have to know what the business side roughly is and be able to negotiate. And then they have to be able to, from the other side, especially when we start talking about software engineering, they're going to have to know the technical people who are on the Scrum team and what their capabilities are. Regularly, one of the things that you hear is that the Scrum Master could be a project manager, could be a this, could be a that. Well, that's all good. I'm all good with the Scrum Master being any number of different roles. But the thing is in the end, They just have to be able to negotiate priorities and inform their product owner. And then they have to be able to mirror both the product owner and the Scrum team when they see things that don't appear to be working. A Scrum team that is dominated by one technical person. A Scrum team that doesn't, that doesn't understand that other people outside are not committed to their success and could be very well intentioned but dragging them off track in terms of their timeline. So we have to work through conflict resolution, this notion of knowledge sharing, one of the key Achilles heels of almost all organizations, and actually a key component of digital transformation. Because the thing about knowledge sharing is that in many organizations, it actually doesn't work very well. There isn't a way, and just for an example, I worked for a very large consulting organization. It was very easy to find all sorts of, promotional and marketing and sales materials, but if I tried to search for something that was source code, good luck. Same thing when you think about it, if I don't have those kind of knowledge management, the Scrum Master in this case, when I recognize as a Scrum Master that my team has created an asset that has value to the organization, I'm going to make sure that we figure out how to get them time negotiated with the product owners so that they can actually turn that into an asset that other parts of the team can use. That means that there could be some documentation, there could be some write-up, some electronic knowledge sharing, there could be some packaging that needs to be done, there could be a demo in terms of a prototype that's part of that. All of these things become packaged as an asset artifact, saved to our knowledge share, populated into our search mechanism for our knowledge, and then become broadly available to everyone within the organization. Now, there are some things like customer data, HIPAA data, top secret algorithms, which do exist in many organizations that do not get published or propagated that way. But for everything else, we really want to move to an open system of knowledge as opposed to need to know. So we're moving away in a DevOps and Agile world from a pure command and control model, which we'll talk about a bit more. So again, Scrum Master facilitating, in this case, mentoring, coaching, and training people to actually move through their process, executing the process. So then we talk to the product owner, really leading the continuous improvement effort in terms of lean thinking, in terms of the interaction with, in some cases, tools. It doesn't have to be a tool specific. It's not a tool focus per se, but there are many cases when tools help us. A lot of people over many years have been using Access and Excel very effectively, and in other cases, using it as a hammer to swat mosquitoes. You can use a fly swatter to swat a mosquito. You could use a hammer. I could use a shotgun. All of those things will kill the mosquito. They have other unintended consequences or side effects of their use. So translating roadmaps into features, essentially, the product owner is giving us our prioritized map to the future with our team. The more complicated part is when I have a maintenance team that's working on a team backlog instead of a product backlog. Essentially, product backlog is dedicated to one application typically. Most and many maintenance teams end up having to share a backlog across multiple products, multiple applications, in which case we call that a team backlog. Yeah, I could most likely have either one or more than one product owner at that point. Those product owners have to negotiate to understand because, as you're probably well aware, if I put two product owners for one Scrum team into a room, neither one of them is suddenly going to say, oh, you know what? You can just have them for as long as you need. When they're done with your stuff, I'll start having my stuff. People don't share that way because they have business priorities. We have to have an open, honest discussion about what can be done in the timeline, what is our velocity, how are we going to share these resources. All of those things become part of that discussion. And really that analysis, because product owners are regularly expected working with the Scrum Master to provide advanced analytics about when our business feature is going to land. That's why we have to have realistic estimates. We have to, if the Scrum team has made estimates, and historically over 2 to 3 or more sprints, those are not panning out, they're not proving to be accurate, for sure that's something the product owner needs to know very quickly so that we can react and get them the information, the visibility, the visualization, so that they can actively predict when things will be ready. For many organizations, when the development team is done with something, there could be many external partners that come into play. For instance, if you're in a military branch, in most countries, the development of some software that's going to become business critical and not, necessarily military critical, because that's a whole nother level, but critical to just running the business, basically your HR system for your military branch. That's not, nobody's going to necessarily drop dead if something doesn't go right, but still people have to understand when features are going to land, how does that fit into our overall architecture vision. Product owner has to at least have guidance from people to be able to really well prioritize and predict, and then do all of the sales and marketing and training and all the other things that are required to launch a product or to revision a product into the market, internal or external. So executive action team. So this is clear, and this is not just Agile, but we talk about it here in terms of an Agile methodology. Executive action team can be any number of different things, but what does this really mean? You have leadership support, because most people in a working role, an architect, a developer, a contract manager, a contract developer, a presentation analyst, any of these roles don't typically have their own budget. Most people in the first 1 to 2 to 3 to more, sometimes more than that, layers of the organization have no budget control. So EAT in this case is people who do have budget, people who actually can help to clear roadblocks. So these are the organizational Scrum Masters. They're the organizational evangelists. They're the organizational stakeholders and, in some cases, sponsors that allow us to get the money we need, the support, the paving the way through the roadblocks, and in many cases, processes. And if you think about it, many people have, words that mean the same that sound quite a bit different when you hear them. Like most organizations have processes. Some people would consider them to be red tape. Most organizations have red tape. Some people would consider those to be processes. So there's an ebb and flow in all of those things when you think about it. And what is it that's required in terms of this process? And processes, of course, very often span teams. So now I'm orchestrating a set of tasks. I'm not necessarily automating one single task. Normally I have a set of tasks that I'm orchestrating that are actually driving out some business value. So leadership recognizing that collaboration rather than command and control enable innovation. If I tell you what to do, you have to do it. If I tell you what to do and I give you an opportunity to self-direct or self-organize, then I'm still having waterfall requirements to Agile development. If I work with you to understand what we need to do to create business value and then let you do it in an Agile stance and an Agile posture, then that means that I'm actually starting to fully engage the value of not only Agile, but also DevOps. So then we get into our little down on the farm thing. No surprise, you'll see plenty of these, and I like the whole Lego piece because, again, this goes back to some of the Lego for Scrum stuff, and we'll actually leave this quickly. But basically, this is the notion of who is really on the hook to deliver something. Who are the people who are part of that are going to add or take away our value in terms of our ability to deliver? And then who are the people that are neither, which could be very well-meaning or very not well-meaning, as we see with our little Kylo Ren. So, hey pig, we should open up a restaurant, cluck cluck. I'm not sure what would we call it, oink oink, says Mr. Pig. Ham and eggs. Well, you get the vision from Mr. Pig. And of course, the oink oink, no thanks, I'd be committed, but you'd only be involved. And if you think about it, this is the story of most people's lives, is that there's things that I'm on the hook to deliver, and yet I could regularly have people calling me, walking into my office, pinging me, texting me, all sorts of things, lots of distractions. I mean, social media can be very valuable in an endless stream of distractions across LinkedIn, Pinterest, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, which I probably already said twice. You know, there's lots of these, because actually LinkedIn can be a double distraction because it's both business and social media. And if you look on images.google.com or any of your favorite image places, you'll see there are probably thousands of these. Some of them are a little not politically correct. So how are our Agile teams forming consistently? So if you think about it, and of course you're welcome to jump in if you've got thoughts on this or comments, you know, please feel free to interact. But what is the consistent formation of those teams? How is that Sprint Zero, that retrospect, the other pieces of Scrum, some of which we actually talked about a bit in detail and others we left out? Because there's quite a bit more to, you know, this is not a learn Agile training. This is some of the basics tied to what is it that we see in terms of best practices, as well as the ditches, the places where people fall in a hole. And this notion of consistency, if you think about it, this is about trying to get people to follow a similar pattern. So if I'm going to do Agile, do I want some teams doing guerrilla programming, some doing XP, some doing Kanban, some doing, you know, Scrum? Maybe if I'm just starting out, but most likely I want to start narrowing the focus on that so that I can have people who become experts in that, you know, methodology. And then I have the ability to really become great at something. Because as my first IBM, you know, leader back in the 90s said, you know, get great and we both make a lot of money. So the next thing we're going to dive into is this notion of, you know, DevOps demystified. So what's involved with DevOps? So here we're actually moving into a little bit more of a menagerie or a zoo metaphor. And why is that? Because for each area of DevOps, there's literally an explosion of tools available. There's tools for this and tools for that, and then you start thinking that tools are the only thing that's there. But really, it's about understanding processes, because if I apply tools to automate it or orchestrate processes, and the process itself is broken, all I'm doing is making an automation of something that stinks. All of these things can be the pond with the giant alligator. So if we become too focused on getting a great tool, we lose focus on what is it that drives business value. I could really manage projects with Excel, and I can manage projects with WordPad or Notepad, but is there additional value provided by using a software engineering project management tool, for using a contract management tool, for using an infrastructure or cloud provisioning tool? All of these things are what is needed, not follow the fireflies. And of course, there's a lot of different sizes and shapes and stripes and animals in this world. The animal kingdom very closely, in many cases, mirrors the world of DevOps, at least in my world. Now, it's not like the insect kingdom, because there we have quite a few more. If you think about it, you know, there's probably, just in the terms of parrots, there's 150 or more kinds of parrots in this world. There's probably equally that many in terms of number of different continuous integration consoles that we could have. So there is some mirroring there in terms of what we see. And rapidly we see some of these, you know, tools following kind of a sad side of the animal kingdom, becoming extinct and being replaced with something else. And even the knowledge of a tool that I was using 3 years ago is probably not current today because of the evolution. So knowledge management turbocharges the team utilizing the menagerie. So again, here I have to have some way to actually harvest that knowledge of DevOps and then share it across the organization. Because this Achilles heel of knowledge management is something we regularly see. Can someone who's used to taking care of elephants walk in and suddenly start taking care of your, you know, crested cockatoo birds? Well, maybe, but they would have to be somebody who is, number one, probably already went and asked somebody, did some research, did some study. So before we broadly, bring a tool out into our organization, especially in a very large organization, we need to spend some time understanding what are the risks, what are the opportunities, basically the whole SWOT analysis of each tool. Now, again, if we're going to do a SWOT on a tool, are we going to take 6 months to do that? Well, optimally, no. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for a particular tool should really be focused on what do we need to get done now, what is our short-term tactical wins out of this, what is our strategic positioning for that tool, and all of this back into this notion of our knowledge management for our organization. So standards and governance. Well, this is a funny one because you think about it all the time. People regularly say to me, well, we don't even need documentation anymore. We just write code, and then the system is self-documenting. Well, the funny part of that is systems are only self-documenting to the people who wrote them. And if the people who wrote them are going to live forever because they found the fountain of youth and they're going to do the same job forever, then maybe that's okay. But for the rest of us in the world, we need to have some consistency, because once we have that, we can create the gold master for microservices, the gold master for the use of Scrum in a sprint, Zero, the gold master for how we're going to do configuration management and containerization and virtualization and cloud native application modernization for the hundreds and sometimes thousands of applications that most organizations have. And hopefully our tiger is one cute little tiger like the one we have here. So some of that is the transparency. I mean, all of this in terms of standards and governance has to take into account, what is our budget? What are the number of people we have? I mean, the average for most organizations now is about $1,000, somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 a year per team member. So if you have, 5,000 people in your organization in IT, the idea is that you're roughly spending somewhere between $5 and $10 million teaching them what you have. And that training, that learning can be done in all sorts of different fashions. They can be creating prototypes. Of course, we want people to get hands-on. We want them to understand because, again, many people are tactile learners. Going back to our, types of learning, audio, visual, tactile. Not many people learn software engineering through smell, but, the idea here is, of course, that once we put people's hands into something, then we can actually guardrail their making mistakes. Because governance and standards are about providing guardrails to people. And when we think about the volume of change occurring now, very similar to what we would have saw in the early, late 80s, early 90s in terms of the internet. The growth of the internet, the volume of changes that was happening, the amount of things that were turning upside down happening again right now. So from a DevOps perspective, we have to keep in mind this idea of continuous integration and continuous delivery. So the thing here is that we also have to get to the right cadence. So the cadence of CI/CD for one organization may be very different from that from another organization. Somebody who's doing, integration testing once every 3 months or 5 months or 6 months, we don't turn on an every day. We slowly evolve them to that. And so the evolution of this is a key concept as well, because we're not revolutionizing the world, especially in a large organization. We're evolving the people that are there to become more efficient, more effective, to still allow us to have significant quality, but also into this notion of velocity. So here, this development practice, the integration, all of these things are about getting not only the defects out on the table faster, but more importantly, recognizing gaps in intent, giving people a show. What is it you can see so you can decide, what's working and not. And then for most organizations, there's a focus now on pipelining software. So a pipeline, like an oil pipeline, is about delivering something, in that case oil, from one location to another. Here, a pipeline is, instead of automating a task, a pipeline is actually an orchestration of a process. So when we think about software engineering, or really any process that we have, we want to be able to test for standards, test for completeness, understand where we are versus our goal. What is the team's velocity in terms of creation? Are they on track for what we're thinking? Are they burning hot, burning cold? And then how do we get the business involved so they can see what we're doing, get excited, hopefully tell us we're doing great, and then alternatively, tell us where there's opportunities. So this involves creating releases. If I was in, again, not necessarily in software engineering, if I was taken into a presentation mode, what is it that allows me to release this presentation for a particular offering to my customers, to my leadership? Because I could have multiple releases. If I'm doing a presentation for an offering, I'm going to release it to my boss, then to some leadership, finally to some customers, and then iteration between each step. So this notion of iteration, this I'm getting feedback. My boss says, I hate the colors in the deck. I don't like those little snuggly tigers. Then they suddenly disappear. So lots of things like that. But it's hopefully a negotiation and a discussion rather than, necessarily command and control. And then if you think about it, now we get into this, what is the current state or the foundation for DevOps in your organization? If you don't know, you're not probably alone. Because in many organizations, leadership or a leadership group or an innovation group is deciding that we're going to do something a certain way, and that information is not necessarily flowing seamlessly to all areas of the organization. Agile is the same way. Different portfolios or federated line of business or solution delivery groups can be creating completely different value streams for essentially doing similar or the same task. So what are those foundations to make your handoffs more efficient and effective in your organization for anything that you create, anything that any human being creates? And then, of course, in the future, we'll start thinking about how do we use, AI, machine learning to augment human performance and support our innovation, our competitive advantage, our time to value, all of these things that we need to really be efficient and effective. So then we're going to bounce into digital transformation, assuming that, let's see, I better double check on the questions. I am not seeing any, so that is good. Obviously, I must be either being very clear or boring the living heck out of people, or some combination of both. So hopefully this is turning out to be useful. If not, please tell me. I will be happy to tailor to the audience. So now we're going to get into, again, this transformation 4. So life is like riding a bicycle. So to keep your balance, you must keep moving. So Albert Einstein, great quote. This whole idea is the story of almost all organizations. So if you think about it, in the 1800s, there was an organization that started as basically as a paper pulp milling. So taking pulp to create paper because of the need for books. And so then as a result of creating paper, they got into the communication, essentially the newspaper and periodical business. As a result of being in communication and the advent of electricity at the early part of last century, they started getting into the electrical and the flow of information over electronics, and eventually became a communications media company, gradually working their way into the cell phone business, became one of the largest cell phone companies in the entire planet, $40 billion a year, 120 plus countries spanning. And then, unfortunately, they missed their pivot. So their pivot was taken over by other companies. In this case, in this market, the Apples, the Samsungs, the Googles. And of course, who is that storied company? started many years ago, and going through that communication industry, well, no surprise, that is Nokia. So hopefully Nokia will match their next pivot, and I'm sure there's lots of things that they're doing right now. If they were like Kodak, who I just saw got into blockchain, Kodak outlined that they're going to start working in blockchain, and no surprise, their stock went up 118%. So that's actually pretty impressive. Send out an announcement and then see if people, there, but that's not sustainable. Here we want sustainable, because if I stop pedaling the bike, sooner or later it's going to fall over. And then we get into this notion of the backwards brain bicycle. So if you've seen this presentation, great. There have been quite a few million people who probably have in this world. But really this is the notion of both learning and unlearning as we move into this world of transformation for digital, transformation for the future. And so we'll actually work our way through that a little bit. So something to actually consider here. What I'm going to do is actually freeze this for a second. Let's do a little freezer. Come on. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. That works. I don't know what this is doing. 2 hands for beginners. Let's pause that for just a second while I sort out what's going on here with my deck. All right, there we go. All right. Now, of course, there always has to be some small challenge in almost anything in our world. Shift Alt F5. Ta-da! Oh, it's still not showing though. All right, so let's try this. I hope this works. We will know in just a second.
Hey, it's me, Destin. Welcome back to Smarter Every Day. You've heard people say it's just like riding a bike, meaning it's really easy and you can't forget how to do it, right? I need to tell you the backstory. Like many 6-year-olds with a MacGyver mullet, I learned how to ride a bike when I was really young. I had learned a life skill and I was really proud of it. Everything changed though when my friend Barney called me 25 years later. Where I worked, the weld.
Okay, so now I just realized that I did not actually start the sharing. That is not very helpful. All right, let's try that one more time and see how we do. Let's try that one more time and see how we do. All right.
Hey, it's me, Destin. Welcome back to Smarter Every Day. You've heard people say it's just like riding a bike, meaning it's really easy and you can't forget how to do it, right? I need to tell you the backstory. Like many 6-year-olds with a MacGyver mullet, I learned how to ride a bike when I was really young. I had learned a life skill and I was really proud of it. Everything changed, though, when my friend Barney called me 25 years later. Where I work, the welders are geniuses, and they like to play jokes on the engineers. He had a challenge for me. He had built a special bicycle, and he wanted me to try to ride it. He had only changed one thing. When you turn the handlebar to the left, the wheel goes to the right. When you turn it to the right, the wheel goes to the left. I thought this would be easy, so I hopped on the bike, ready to demonstrate how quickly I could conquer this.
And here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jesse Fallon. First attempt riding the bicycle.
I couldn't do it. You can see that I'm laughing, but I'm actually really frustrated. In this moment, I had a really deep revelation. My thinking was in a rut. This bike revealed a very deep truth to me. I had the knowledge of how to operate the bike, but I did not have the understanding. Therefore, knowledge is not understanding. Look, I know what you're probably thinking. Destin's probably just an uncoordinated engineer and can't do it. But that's not the case at all. The algorithm that's associated with riding a bike in your brain is just that complicated. Think about it. Downwards force on the pedals, leaning your whole body, pulling and pushing the handlebars, gyroscopic precession in the wheels. Every single force is part of this algorithm. And if you change any one part, it affects the entire control system. I do not make definitive statements that often, but I'm telling you right now, you cannot ride this bicycle. You might think you can, but you can't. I know this because I'm often asked to speak at universities and conferences, and I take the bike with me. It's always the same. People think they're going to try some trick or they're just going to power through it. It doesn't work. Your brain cannot handle this. For instance, this guy, I offered him $200 just to ride this bike 10 feet across the stage. Everybody thought he could do it.
No, you didn't understand. So, this way. Whenever you're ready. No, you have to keep your feet on.
It was a personal challenge. I stayed out here in this driveway and I practiced about 5 minutes every day. My neighbors made fun of me. I had many wrecks, but after 8 months, this happened. One day I couldn't ride the bike, and the next day I could. It was like I could feel some kind of pathway in my brain that was now unlocked. It was really weird, though. It's like there's this trail in my brain, but if I wasn't paying close enough attention to it, my brain would easily lose that neural path and jump back onto the old road it was more familiar with. Any small distractions at all, like a cell phone ringing in my pocket, would instantly throw my brain back to the old control algorithm, and I would wreck. But at least I could ride it.
Perfect. So hopefully that was entertaining. You can find that on YouTube. That is just a chunk of that video. And of course, you can buy t-shirts and all sorts of other things tied to that video, which is of use for anybody who needs a new t-shirt. All right, so let's go. There's this. Yeah, thank you, Dustin. All right, so then changing the narrative. You know, in many cases, what we've got to do is start to change the overall narrative. And that's, you know, not all that easy to do. Because there's a lot of process. There's actually an organizational structure in place to prevent unwanted changes in your organization. Every organization has this. A lot of times, it's known as your human resources function. It could also be tied to your leadership function. So if you think about this, this is a great example of all the different areas where we have to involve people to make something happen, to change something across an organization. How the customer explains it, how we bill it, how the help desk supports it, you know, lots of different things. And of course, this is a bit tongue-in-cheek. This is hopefully supposed to be funny. Because obviously we don't want to build a roller coaster unless we're in the amusement business, and cutting down trees for no purpose is a little annoying as well. So snares, traps, and tales of woe. So here we get into the notion of, you know, things that people do that turn out to be just horribly wrong for the right reason, for the right thinking and the wrong reaction. So fragmentation. So more and more we see people saying, don't start small with a change, just get everybody to do it at the same time. And what I find is that Big Bang Theory is unless it is very, very straightforward to do something very complex across your entire organization, the amount of time you're going to drag your organization down usually means you have to stop doing large amounts of what you already do. That, for most companies that are not born internet, is absolutely impossible. The people that are called out for doing this big bang is companies like Salesforce doing Agile all at once. Well, big bang on Agile for an organization that's running something online that doesn't have planes dropping out of the air or people dying when things go wrong, yeah, very possible. But for many other organizations, this is, more painful. And this notion of fragmentation is what results in most organizations who are siloed or portfolioed or have multiple lines of business or geographically separated. Everybody starts doing something at once, and rapidly, because the governance and the actual process is not clear, people evolve it in different ways. How does that happen? Well, I can think of many organizations where right now they're doing DevOps, and each part of the organization is doing it slightly different. They're doing Agile, and each portion of the organization is doing it slightly different. They're using different companies to do training. They're using different companies to train different roles. They're using different materials from different vendors. They're using all sorts of differences that actually cause problems in terms of getting to that idea of consistency for what it is that they're actually building. We should probably plug that in. So then we get into this idea of, let's go back up and let's get rid of my screen that tells me that my power is about to die. And so we'll get into this notion of meeting cadence. So I am very sorry, that was inappropriately loud and me crashing the phone as I realized that I somehow unplugged my computer. There we go. So yesterday in our 4-hour meeting, we agreed to postpone vendor selection. No, we agreed to use I thought we agreed to this, and oh, by the way, we better have another 4-hour meeting. So in many organizations, meetings are part of just basic blocking and tackling. People will start to put signs on the wall that says, every meeting needs an agenda, every meeting needs notes, every meeting needs this, and then shortly they stop following it. So the idea is why are you having this sprint review, sprint planning, sprint retrospect, this DevOps workshop, this, skinny learning if you're doing brown bags, things like that. Always keep clarity of what you're doing. Come with an agenda or some planning so that people, if they're going to sit in a room with you, get something out of it. Hopefully everyone knew that what they were getting when they came to this session. And if you didn't, then you have my apologies, and hopefully it will stay on our meeting cadence. So starting timely, stopping timely, moving from option to option. And of course, you'll get the deck if you don't already have it. So one size fits all. So if you think about it, the whole one size fits all thing is big fish, tiny bowl, tiny fish, big bowl. And here, one size very rarely fits all. Like I work for an organization and the architecture group is primarily using Java. So they came up with tools and patterns for DevOps around Java and completely excluded all of the people. Why are you all over the map? I'm not sure what that means. So I'm not sure what that means because this is, I think, primarily about Agile and DevOps. So if you have a little bit more to the question, I'd be happy to answer it, but I don't think there are any maps in any of the pictures we've had so far, and so I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'm happy to articulate if you've got something that actually gives me a little bit more depth there. So the one size fits all is the idea that the same tool can be used for every single portion of the organization. In a small organization, one size might fit all, but in many organizations, they have a grid or some kind of vendor management that says, here's what you can use, in this portion of the organization for a piece of software, for a library, for all of these things. And so this is where, when we think about it, the idea of DevOps and Agile are all part of a larger portion of application modernization, which is, of course, one of the key underpinnings or one of the key equal signs to in our case, digital transformation. So we're talking about basically two pieces of an overall digital transformation. And what does that actually turn into for most people in software engineering is how is it that we're going to take 100, 200, 500, 1,000 applications and turn them into the future in 1 to 3 to 5 to 10 to 20 years. So this one-size-fits-all very rarely works in a very large organization. For individual areas, it may, but that means I'm going to have to develop subject matter expertise to be able to be self-organizing and self-supporting. Or in many cases, if I'm using enterprise, the IBMs, the HPs, the CAs, I'm going to want my vendors to actually bring something to the table in terms of Agile and DevOps. What is it that you have in terms of, for instance, if I'm buying a third-party software from one of these large vendors, what is it you have that supports my version of Agile, my brand of Agile, the tools that I'm using in DevOps? Are you working with them? Is this actually something that you can help us to understand within the context of the organization so that we can have one size fits many, and then from that, a rigorous yet accelerated exception process. So over-engineering, over-planning, overkill. So what we dream up at the kickoff, what we settle for at launch, and what the customer wanted. If we're not understanding our customers, and almost all of us are both producers and consumers, many organizations, in terms of their DevOps and Agile flows, are asking their teams to go to the people who consume what you produce and ask what it is that you're doing that enables them, and what is it that's actually an opportunity. What are the strengths and weaknesses, the opportunities from within? Are there threats that they see externally to our function, our job, our technology that we can actually react to and create a more efficient and effective process? So this is the idea too, is that when we start a project, we don't necessarily have to know every single thing we're going to do. We don't have to have 100% of our requirements. Now, if we're in a waterfall budgeting organization where they're going to give us a box of money and a box of time and a box of, in this case, time, talent, and treasure, then of course we have to be more considerate of anything we take on. If somebody tells me I have to be done in 6 months with a $3 million budget with this team, and I take on work that's unexpected, then I have to remove something, or I have to have a clear process that allows me to get an approval from someone who owns the budget, from a product owner or business stakeholder, to say, and a lot of times from a technology leader, this is the overage we're going to have. This is the actual, deviance that we're going to have, or drift, and of course making sure that we get all of that typically in writing. So if we think about this, this ties back to not only just the military, which is referenced here, but command and control. So Agile is not a command and control framework. Agile is about self-organizing teams, the opposite of command and control. Agile is about people understanding their own workflows and trying to optimize them. Again, not command and control. So some of these patterns really tie, and as you see here, basically this person on the left is getting guidance. They're saying yes, sir, and of course, what they don't see is the giant tiger about to leap onto the person behind them, and assumedly use them as a snack bar. So Agile and DevOps are all about the tools. Well, actually, they're not all about the tools. If you think about it, if you had this knife, this Swiss Army knife, it's unlikely that you could actually do most things with it, because it is so over-engineered and has so many things going on with it that it'd be difficult to actually know which blade to pull out. I mean, in this case, there are, you know, literally 100 different functions on this one tool. That's almost to the point of being unusable, because of somebody would have to have essentially months or years of training to actually, you know, do that. Moving to, thank you. That is a good question. Moving to. Thank you, Shan. So here, the message that people had, you know, with DevOps 5 years ago is you buy our tool set, and you're now DevOps. People will say if you're using cloud, you're doing DevOps. If you're not using cloud, you're not DevOps. If you're not doing everything in Scrum, you're not Agile. Can you do things in waterfall and still be Agile? Yes. Is it helpful to have an Agile methodology to do Agile if you're doing software engineering? Well, most likely. However, if you think about it, the majority of the organizations, if you found somebody who was actually doing pure Scrum, the theory of Scrum, and turning it into reality, that'd be unlikely. I have met no one yet in the last 15 years who really was, since Scrum was invented. So going it alone is always a bad idea. So it's not to say that you can't grassroots Agile, you can't grassroots DevOps. You can. You can start small and work out. You can have just your team doing it. But the problem is that, you know, if everyone was the Lone Ranger, we'd have a lot of people going in different directions. We'd end up with fragmentation. For Agile and DevOps to really become part of an organizational change, to become anchored in the organization, which is the key to any organizational change management, you have to be able to, you know, ensure that there are more than just a few people doing it. And that means budget, that means leadership support, that means an executive action team, all of those kinds of folks. So now I seem to have two of these. Oh, I see what I did. Let us stop on that. Let's jump back into here. I went to one of my edit decks. There's that. Let's try that again. There we go. All right, so we got that one. And so, you know, continuous learning opportunities. So if you think about it, the DevOps Handbook, one of those recommended readings, the 3 foundations for DevOps from the handbook, written by, you know, arguably some of the people who have probably done as much in terms of, you know, sharing, learning, original authors and participants in the project, in the Phoenix project, people who regularly, you know, participate in conferences, Gene Kim, Jez Humble, Patrick Du Bois, who is the person who actually created the hashtag, and then John Allspaw from Etsy, all part of that DevOps Handbook and continuous learning. If it doesn't already feel like it, all of us are into the world of continuous learning. So success stories and some best practices. So when we think about this, our success stories and our best practices are really things that have worked out well for people. Now, visualization. So if you're not already part of the world that has to be doing visualization, then you've managed to somehow escape that for some period of time, because the majority of the rest of us, our leadership is expecting that we're now be giving them ways to better make decisions. So that's Kanban boards or Scrumban boards like we're showing here. That's Jenkins or some other kind of CI dashboard in terms of our automation, our Agile testing. It could be some other kind of automated reporting in terms of dashboards. And regularly I look to, you know, the Amazon Web Services, the Azure, and the Google Cloud Platform dashboards, because they really do give you a visibility for software engineering across a broad spectrum of everything from infrastructure to team to process to timing to deployments to bandwidth to, you know, so many of these different things, because they have to support everything that you could run in cloud in terms of that information. So pretty key in terms of recognizing this as a pattern, because most organizations, the leadership is looking for better visualization so that they can understand where there are issues and help, and where there are things going great and reward. So from a focus factor, this is about understanding that almost everything in the world, when it's first started, when you first try to do something, it's an anchor. So if you were to try to ride that backwards brain bicycle, first of all, you'd have to unlearn how to ride a regular bike and relearn how to ride this new bike. And as Destin Sandlin said in his video, it took him 3 months to actually be pretty bad at riding a bike. Because if you look at him riding that bike, he's not good at it yet. He just can barely do it. For those of us who have to be great at something, we have to think about how long is it going to take us to get there? What is it from a knowledge management? And then also, if we're leaders in this space, what is it we do to augment that performance, but also don't over-exceed or overstate the expectations for what people can deliver? So here, in Scrum or DevOps or QA or anything where we're using new, initially the technology, the process changes are all anchors. So that means they weigh us down, they create friction, they create drag, they create drift from plan. And here we're looking at what is it that we can put in as, for lack of a better word, they call it a focus factor, a human factor, but some people would call this the fudge factor. What is it that I'm giving someone a break because they're learning as they're doing it? And then once they get good at it, of course, we reduce the factor until the factor is 0. This is basically our shim to make our team actually still average productivity and velocity over time. So then value stream mapping. So value stream mapping is really the understanding of the processes within the organization. So DevOps is about as much automating processes as it is the tools that are used to do this, from configuration management. Agile likewise. Regularly we're doing a review to see how things went in a sprint. We're tuning if our estimates are off over a number of sprints or a number of cycles in terms of the work we're doing. We're recognizing that, we're updating our estimates. Is it something where the estimates long-term are going to be off by a percentage, or is it that they're just wrong to begin with and we have to now understand that? Because like anything, value stream maps allow us to optimize our relay. So if you think about it, Usain Bolt arguably one of the fastest people on the entire planet, probably ever. Amazing runner, but also an amazing relay runner. So he's able to run at the speed of any human being as fast and do an amazing handoff, and in some cases, as you can see in video, catch the baton and put it back in the person's hand when they're about to drop it as he's doing a handoff. All of these things are incredibly important. The optimizing our handoffs, and that's what value stream mapping is. So we have to understand what it is that does value. So here, it could be a contract, it could be a piece of software, it could be the provisioning of an environment, it could be anything that as a business we do. Any task I have can be value streamed. Now, the idea here is that individual tasks contribute to an overall process. The process is part of the value stream. I then orchestrate the process and automate it and provide dashboards to give me visibility in terms of the analytics of it. So this analyzing and reflect, after I understand a process, then I'm going to analyze it. I'm going to look at what that current state is, map out a future state that reduces the drag or increases the output that I'm getting out of it. And then looking in terms of continuous improvement, I've got to socialize this because, again, most processes are across multiple groups or people for sure. And I got to make sure everybody agrees that we captured this current process, that the future state actually is something we can do. We train people how that's going to work so that they can hit the ground running, because most people are not afraid of change as much as they are afraid of not knowing how to do their job. If we're going to make a change, what do I need to know to do my job effectively and efficiently? And then lastly, sustainability means creating metrics, measuring the performance, monitoring that, governance in terms of making sure people are following the change that we have, and giving them a rigorous yet accelerated process of exception if they have an improvement to the process that they can test out and bring back to us in terms of how did it go. So when we think about this from a gold master perspective, this is not about the little gold robots, although they're pretty cute little transformers. Gold master means if I was going to do Agile across an entire organization, if I did the start small or I did the big bang, either way, once I had a project that was successful with Agile, I pick up the estimations, the assets, the user stories, the flow, the team dynamics, anything that I've captured in terms of software, solution, documents, I bring them back and I set those up as the Gold Master. Here is how we do this amazing. I'm using Chef or Puppet or Salt from a DevOps perspective. Once I have a great pattern set up, I want to create templates that act as the Gold Master to show other people how to use the tool. Gold Master is about leveraging the expertise of what you're doing within your organization to solution a problem to add business value. So governance actually plays into this all the time, because governance is part of, making sure that we don't, expose a ton of credit card information to the internet, as happened in a very large target-shaped organization. That for one of our, companies that does credit scoring, then and actually risk management, that they don't have situations where we're using, passwords and user IDs for administration that are the same, and exposing, customers to an extreme amount of stress, exposing our leadership team to likely probably getting thrown out of the organization. And all of this in terms of governance is not going to disappear. Agile and DevOps don't remove standards. They don't change the need to understand what we're doing. They don't change the need to govern the process, to be able to have people who know why we're doing what we're doing, get consistency in how we're doing it, and then still allow for the flexibility, the feedback, the continuous learning, the flow that both Agile and DevOps for success require. So more in terms of positives, pair programming. Now, how we do this really depends on the organization itself. We can have people actually working on something and switching back and forth. Oh, what happened there? That's weird. Yeah, we don't want that. Why is it doing that screeny thing? Whoops. That's not what I wanted. All right. Now it's doing it right. Thank you. I actually didn't catch that. I'm so used to presenting these decks as all right, flip through at 100 miles an hour. Hopefully this is the deck review. Thank you very much. There we go. Now we're finally back to where we need to be. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I didn't catch that sooner. Yeah, that's annoying, especially since most of those notes are actually wrong. So awesome if you're reading the notes and be like, well, why is that note nothing to do with this deck? Because the notes themselves were part of, pieces of other things that we tied together. So hopefully nothing annoying in any of those notes. So the idea here, of course, is this thought of doing the driver, whoever is learning. And so obviously, if I'm doing this in an Agile methodology and I'm going to have tasks that are going to tie back to it, a lot of times I now, because especially in Scrum, I would have to write user stories that actually allow me to have the person who's going to be doing the driving and the person who's going to be doing the learning participating. That's why in a lot of cases, I wouldn't necessarily make it all the time a one-to-one. Not surprisingly, people are less likely in the organization not to, not only the one-to-one, but they're also more and more people will text the person sitting next to them in a cube rather than actually speak to them. So sitting two people in a cube together to actually do programming is an entertaining task to watch. It's something at least worth building that communication. It isn't that I would want to put two people who actively dislike each other in a pair programming role either, without having someone who actually facilitates that discussion. So shared responsibility. So if you think about it, the notion of cloud is shared responsibility, but Agile and DevOps all have shared responsibility. The DevOps part, of course, not just Dev and Ops, all brains in the game. So if you think about it, that all brains in the game means everybody gets into the action. Everybody gets to have input. Everybody gets to help us improve this process. And of course, trust but verify from Ronald Reagan taken from an old Russian proverb, which we have here as well. So if that doesn't look familiar, of course, that's written anglicized Russian and not actually in the Cyrillic alphabet. So test-driven development. So what is it that we're, doing? So we write the test, then we write, whatever it is in terms of that minimum amount of code, and then refactor as needed to meet that definition of done. Now, regularly with enterprise people, when they first move into, test-driven development, and whether that be in, using Agile, or in some cases, since we're in most DevOps environments, we're doing infrastructure as code, which also I can do test-driven development on. I write what I minimally need right now. Because if you think about it, people who are experienced, have significant enterprise experience, they know that whatever you're writing in terms of a microservice eventually might be needed for 1 million or 10 million or 100 million requests in a day. They could extend the quality that we need right now and actually create more value. But the thing is do we need that right now? Because if we're prototyping, if we're actually just trying to get something in front of the business, I want to reduce the amount of time every single task is taking. Not, I gave it an 8-hour estimate, I finished the test, I finished the code for the test-driven design, satisfaction in 2 hours. I may allow people to exceed the quality based on the timing, or if we're running behind, going yellow, going red, I would like to take that extra 6 hours and use that to catch up. So Kaizen and this whole notion of good change. So Kai, change, Zen, good, so good change. Or, in my world, change is good. So the idea here, Kaizen or continual improvement, continuous improvement goes back to lean. So Toyota production system. So that's removing waste, removing tasks that we don't need to do. It's also a part of not overworking people. So that means that we ensure that our teams actually understand their commitment, that we're flexible enough when they're starting so that we can actually shift the tasks slightly if they're not making their commitment, so that we can still make our deadlines as easily as possible. And of course, nothing's always that easy. And then Kaizen from a skills management perspective for both Agile and DevOps, as well as into cloud and other areas of digital transformation, is understanding who knows what. Who are our experts in our methodology? Who is our expert mentoring Scrum Master, our expert product owner, or team of those for that matter? We see lots of patterns that don't seem to indicate change. An organization that I worked with that had all the Scrum Masters actually sit in the same area and didn't sit with their teams, which is very counterintuitive for people who are doing Scrum. So what is it in terms of those capabilities that we have across Agile and DevOps and the other areas of digital transformation for our organization that we can measure so that we can understand how people can cross-connect to become better at the jobs and the skills and the tasks and competencies they need to move the organization forward? So Agile software engineering patterns. So this actually gets back indirectly to the notion of Gold Master. So patterns, especially when we start talking about code, because in a lot of organizations, people think that the architecture group is losing or lost touch with the notion of Agile because they have all these standards and patterns and the rest of it. But literally, EA, business, solution architecture, data, infra arcs are all the people who are trying to help to provide patterns and standardization, which allow us to be more consistent across the organization. We have to know what we're supposed to use in terms of the tools to build our applications. And in some cases, that's because those tools might help us to improve our governance. They might reduce our security risks. They might be something that we are allowed to use because we have enterprise licensing, and so they're paid for by another organization or funded by the organization's corporate section or something like that. All of these things then mean we need to know what is the pattern, where is it used, why is it used, how is it used, where is the exceptions to using this, where is the story that we're telling across this pattern, and of course, If it's something to do with coding, I would like to see some source code as an example of that prototype using that pattern. And that example should be noted if it's just a working example and it's just something that's being thrown out versus a gold master example which says you should use this pattern in this way with this code for this platform and this tool. So specialization and generalization. So, one of the key things that's called out for many people in terms of Scrum originally is that everyone should be able to do everything on a Scrum team. Anybody should be able to take any task. But in reality, most people are not clones. If I get a team of 5 people, it's unlikely that all 5 of them know how to do the same thing at the same level of quality, consistency, and for sure depth of knowledge. So I may have specialization within my Scrum team for things like UI UX, which is regularly an area of specialization unless they're on an entire UI UX Scrum team, which again, very unlikely. So QA and performance, that testing and especially performance testing is a very specific skill, especially in an enterprise where you're going to do hundreds of millions of transactions in a given period of time. So anything that's going to have significant performance impact, obviously that's a specialized skill set. And then generalized does not mean commodity. It means the majority of our team will understand or be able to function in that. And I can take someone who knows Java or C# or C++ or Node.js, and I can have them work into QA or some other type of function. But what I want to actually make sure is that I have the time. A lot of times as a Scrum Master, I want to guide decisions that people take in terms of taking tasks, because in some cases, when we're not ahead of schedule, I want them to take whatever is something they're the best at, and in other cases, I'm happy to have them take tasks that they can learn. So how does this all fit together? So Agile architecture means, keep it simple. All teams that code must also help in terms of that design. Why? Because then that helps to grow them into that architecture practice. It helps them to be engaged with architecture. And then, of course, it helps them to understand what our patterns are. Why do we build things the way we do? So don't over-engineer. So no over-engineering or over-architecting, as we said. Those are actually the downsides. So trying to, again, what do we need right now? And the current tool we have might be fine. There's no sense to switch tools or processors or platforms unless there's some overall guidance which is going to show that that change is going to increase our productivity, increase our customer satisfaction, increase our revenue, or reduce our costs. Because in the end, all of us are really here, and architecture supports 2 things, revenue and customer. Because revenue and customer are the key elements for almost everybody in terms of, why they have a job, why we're all here, and most likely, hopefully this notion of continuous learning tied to those 2 areas for why folks are on the phone for an extended session on a Friday with George. So, by the way, thank you for taking your Friday afternoon or morning or evening, depending on where you live, to spend some time with me. So teams that build must test the system. So if you think about it, that whole testing and building, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to be great at QA, everybody has to be testing, but when we're thinking about it, most of this is trying to, start to automate Agile testing. What is it we're doing? I mean, there's a lot of organizations who are now trying to teach their QA people how to be, Java programmers with Cucumber or something else. And I'm interested to watch, because programming is usually a pretty special skill set. If you can be a great programmer, that's excellent, but that doesn't necessarily mean everybody in the world is. And then, of course, governance, because what is the point of governance is to keep people on the same track, to keep people within the guardrails. So we've got teams and programs and portfolios. So this gets into Agile portfolio management, Agile program management, Agile team management. So I can have people working in Scrum and Scrum teams, and then of course, how are they actually communicating their wins? What is our platform architecture and our release planning, our backlogs, our story or mind maps, and then, tying back largely into how do our features across Scrum teams actually tie together to create a minimum viable product? What is our notion of minimum viable product? And hopefully that the discussion of MVP is something that's going on, discussion of 12-factor app. I mean, Agile and DevOps are two key pieces of, again, digital transformation, and also two key pieces of application modernization. So not only are those, great consulting buzzwords for getting your money, but they're also useful ideas for those of us who work in technology or really in any space for a technology-enabled business. So feel free to share success stories. We've had, people being fairly quiet, but that's okay. It is a Friday. So if you have questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to raise them. I know that there was a start of something earlier, and I never really understood what the direction was there. And I'm happy to, again, take any questions that anybody has. Otherwise, I'm going to give you your day back. And I see that I've already started losing a few people. You see the presenter's view. Thank you for telling me that. I'm so sorry. I was hoping to see pitfalls of moving Agile and real-life examples and hoping to see some best practices. So I think we probably did cover that, I'm hoping, in terms of those things that people are doing not so well, and all of that, tied back to really the last 10 years, 5 to 10 years of my life in DevOps, in the last 15 years in Agile. So again, thank you for your time today. I see people are starting to drain. I would be happy to stick around. I have, another 30 odd minutes that we had said we were going to jump this. So if you have some questions, feel free to pound those out. If you're a LinkedIn person, feel free to join my network or have me added to your network on LinkedIn and carry on a dialogue. So otherwise, have a great journey in Agile and DevOps, and thank you for being here today.